Welcome to A Shot in the Arm podcast. I'm Ben Plumley, and this is a podcast about innovation and equity in global health. And for those of us lucky to be working in the field of global health, we are, reeling from what seems to be major steps backward, from the 2022 US Supreme Court decision to reverse decades of access to safe abortion services for women in the US, to the utterly incomprehensible decision by the US House of Representatives not to agree to the approval of the appropriation, the 5-year appropriation of funding for PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the jewel in the crown of President George Bush's presidential legacy. Well, as in other areas of human security, from the Middle East to Ukraine, the US appears to be having a moment of introspective questioning about its role in the world. To borrow a conversation Margaret Thatcher had with George H. Bush when the world kicked Iraq out of an illegal invasion of Kuwait, this is no time to go wobbly. And to help us make sense of what is going on, particularly from a global health perspective, and the cross-cutting imperative of securing the reproductive and sexual health of women across the world, I'm joined by Dr Anu Kumar, an internationally recognized advocate for women's rights and a leader in global health herself. She's president and CEO of IPAS. IPAS is a global reproductive justice organization focused on increasing access to abortion and contraception around the world. She's worked for the WHO, the MacArthur Foundation, and Anu, welcome to A Shot in the Arm podcast. It's really terrific to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thanks for having me.
So, for someone who has spent their career fighting for reproductive justice, this must be a very confusing and difficult time. How are you making sense of it?
You know, it is confusing in some ways and bewildering. But I guess I'm grateful to have a career in global health because while many Americans are feeling really demoralized about what's happened around abortion access in the U.S., and it is demoralizing and deeply upsetting, I think, for those of us who work around the world, we can see progress. And the progress is real, it's tangible, and it's really, hopeful and inspiring. So, 60 countries have liberalized their abortion laws in the last 30 years. And it's so the trend towards abortion liberalization, abortion access to contraception is unmistakable. And it's quite profound. Countries as diverse as Democratic Republic of Congo, as Ireland, as Mexico, Nepal have all liberalized their abortion laws and have made those laws a reality. There are, of course, a handful of countries that are going backwards, 4 to be exact, and the United States is one of them. So, yeah, I mean, the U.S. is not in good company, and as someone who is an American, that is really disturbing. But I don't think that we should feel, and indeed, I think those of us who work in global health know that the United States is certainly not the only country in the world, though it is a very powerful one.
Well, I remember when the Supreme Court decision was made that a lot of folks who supported it said, well, of course, this is purely a US decision. It's not going to affect global strategy. It's not going to affect any other countries. It's our own decision. Has that played out in actuality?
Yes and no. I mean, I think it's safe to say that the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade has had implications for rights around the world. It has definitely had an impact. But the truth is that it wasn't a singular event. I mean, I think for many Americans, it kind of registered as as an earthquake or a giant wake-up call. But for those of us who've been working on reproductive justice for quite a long time, it was anticipated. And it was certainly predictable. And definitely after President Trump came into office, we knew that this was going to happen. What it has done is to really embolden conservative forces, both in the U.S. but also around the world, And they are really working hard to take away not just abortion rights, but an array of human rights, both here and also, overseas and around the world. And I think this is really an important point. I mean, we tend to think of issues, particularly in global health, as being geographically specific, but they're not. And certainly ideology isn't. And the extremism that we saw that brought, that overturned Roe v. Wade is not constrained by the US, by the borders of the United States. It's a transnational movement. And these anti rights actors are active in places like Ethiopia, in Kenya, in India, in Nigeria, really around the world. And they are feeling powerful. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. In Ethiopia, which let me just say that Ethiopia actually has a very liberal abortion law. It has been implemented by the public health system of Ethiopia. Abortions are available throughout Ethiopia. And this is extremely important because Ethiopia is the second most populous country in sub Saharan Africa after Nigeria. So it's a very important country on the continent. But what we're finding now is that anti rights actors are demonstrating in the streets. They're putting pressure on government officials. They've taken to the mass media. They're more vocal and more organized than ever. And they're really, pushing the Ethiopian government to pull back on its progress on abortion care. Kenya. Kenya has introduced an anti-LGBTQI bill that mimics the one in Uganda. India has had legal abortion since 1971, and there have been very few, if no overt anti-abortion campaigns until last year. And last year we saw a March for Life that took place in New Delhi for the first time ever. The work that these anti-rights organizations or the activism that these anti-rights groups are taking is very similar to what we've seen in the US. So, I think this is perhaps the most profound impact of Roe v. Wade is that it's really made these anti-rights actors feel very powerful. And I think they have some right to feel powerful. They scored a major victory in the supposed beacon of democracy, the United States of America.
Wow, I mean, so much to unpack there, Anu. I think the first thing to ask you mentioned Kenya and you mentioned Uganda, and many of the players who were hugely influential in supporting the drive to pass some incredibly draconian anti-LGBT laws. They are also intimately bound up in the anti-choice, anti-reproductive justice agenda. Do you see links between these two more progressive goals in health and rights?
Definitely. And this is not a new linkage. So IPAS has been working on tracking and monitoring anti-rights organizations for over 15 years. And since that time, these two issues have been closely linked. And if you think about it a little more deeply, it's kind of obvious why. I mean, why do anti-rights organizations go after abortion and LGBTQI issues? Because they're both fundamentally about sexuality and the ability of people to control their sexual lives. And this is deeply threatening to those who purport a sort of, quote, traditional family values approach. Now, that is usually code for a white heterosexual family. And that is something that has been under discussion or even controversy really since the 1990s. So this linkage between abortion and gay rights is definitely not new, and it's just getting more and more, I would say, fraught and pronounced. So you mentioned that we were talking about the Uganda bill. Well, one of the things that's really troubling about the ripple effect that it's had in Kenya is that Kenya was the place that many LGBTQI people used to flee and seek asylum. So now that the anti-rights groups have really launched this effort in Kenya, the Ugandans are feeling very trapped. But let me just mention one other linkage. And again, this is about sexuality. the other linkage that I want to mention, or the other issue, is comprehensive sexuality education. So this is another target for these anti-rights forces. And you see it, of course, in the United States, where the vast majority of Americans support comprehensive sexuality education, but very few schools actually provide it. And this is true around the world. Parents, adults generally support comprehensive sexuality education, but it is often the target of these anti-rights groups. So, for example, if you think about the books that are being banned across the United States, well, that's happening in Tanzania. Books
Yeah.
mentioning homosexuality are being banned in Tanzania. So these things are these are related issues, and it's so when we think about abortion, particularly in the U.S., we must contextualize this and remember that it's linked to issues of LGBTQI, comprehensive sexuality education. And I would say even more broader than that, it's linked to human rights in general. And human rights also include civil and political rights, such as voting.
Well, this is where I wanted to sort of explore with you two more questions on this. The first is I wonder if it's not just about control of sexuality, but control period, perhaps control period of women. As you were talking and mentioning books that were being banned, I went right back to The Handmaid's Tale, and wondering, are we, perhaps in that world, Canada remains free, and the United States becomes the Republic of Gilead, a sort of a theocracy that basically excludes women from any expression of their rights beyond, well, their responsibility is to have children, basically. And it struck me that perhaps you and I might be Canadian academics sitting there commenting on what's going on in the Republic of Gilead. But here's the thing: you spoke about voter rights. I'm really seeing that much of the agents that are from the right that are pushing these agendas, they've been around for a while. They're not new. And they have a very explicit agenda of you can't even call it going back to, but creating a very male-centric, white-centric world where, how shall I put it, everybody knows their place. Am I being overly dramatic in that, or do you see that as well?
I wish you were being overly dramatic in that, and I wish it was that we were living we were not living in Margaret Atwood's world. I mean, I read that novel when it first came out, and then I reread it recently, and it is disturbing to see how close she has come to describing our current reality. We are living in a country right now in the United States where women are being forced to give birth against their will. We're living in a country where women are experiencing higher levels of maternal mortality than previous generations. Mm-hmm. So we are not making progress on that. We're living in a world where there is tremendous inequality in maternal deaths and other forms of inequality, not just that one. So yeah, I don't think it's too extreme, and I do, having been in the global health sector for some time, I remember being in the 1994 International Conference of Population and Development in Cairo, where these issues were being very much, discussed and debated, and there was a whole conversation around the meaning of the word family.
Yes.
What does it mean? What does family mean? And the right, and at that time it was the Vatican and I think Yemen that were objecting to the definition of family as being anything but a heterosexual union that existed solely for the purpose of procreation. And so this is the root, I think, of what we're at here. What we're seeing now is this rise of extremism is, and I think you're exactly right about female sexuality in particular. But also sexuality that is not, or sex that is not for procreation. And that is, a lot of sex. So
Right.
they're targeting a very large swath of people. And it's interesting how successful they are, because it is by no means the majority of people anywhere. I mean, our own research at IPAS shows that 9 out of 10 Americans do not support an abortion ban.
Mm.
They just don't.
Mm.
And majority of public opinion, corroborates that. Americans just don't think that this should be as heavily regulated as it is currently being. So what we're seeing is a disconnect in our political lives between our elected representatives and the views of their constituents. You see that most profoundly in places where, in states in the United States that have been gerrymandered, and that's why I think this is related to voting. When you suppress the vote, you are suppressing the will of the people. And the will of the people, at least when it comes to abortion and sex education and gay marriage, is to be more accepting and inclusive.
And I'm thinking of the Washington Post columnist Jennifer Rubin, who commented that we're not dealing with pro-life activism. What we're dealing with is a court decision that has led to forced birth legislation. So some really awful, awful stories of women being forced to carry non-viable fetuses to term, let alone having the ability to decide when and it's right to have and they're ready to have a family. The other thing that you had mentioned was in relation to Kenya, to India, was this sense, and you really do see it across the continent of Africa, certainly, that there is a knee-jerk reaction against the kind of global health and reproductive health activism and advocacy that you and I have been a part of for our careers, and that it's not African. You also hear it being said that it's not Indian. And yet the impetus, the drive, the support for this is actually coming from US organizations. And it's interesting to me that this is happening at a time when within the global health community, we've done our own sort of reflections about what perhaps haphazardly we're calling decolonialization. And I know that's something that's of great interest to you. But if you could help us sort of join the dots from, us beginning to see how we need to be partners, even supporters of local leadership, as opposed to a different kind of white northern colonialism.
So I think it's really important when we start this conversation to think, to try not to think in binaries. I think that binaries are actually part of the colonial project and the colonial mindset. Divide and conquer was a very successful strategy, and it has actually also worked in dividing our thinking as well. And the reason I say that is because I don't actually think that where you're located, particularly today, is as relevant any longer. So whether you're based in the US, whether you're based in Europe, whether you're based in Africa, is less important than what you know. What expertise do you bring? And what I mean by expertise isn't just sort of the degrees and the education that many of us have had access to, but also the lived knowledge and experience of people. So I'm an anthropologist by training, and one of the things that I did as an anthropologist early on in my career was to talk to women about their reproductive decision making. How were they making decisions? What were their constraints? What were the factors that they were taking into account when they were choosing, or not in some cases, to have children? And when asking people, and I've actually asked women all over the world now throughout my career this question of, so how did you decide to have these children, or what led to that, you having 2 children or 3 children or 8 children? And some women will definitely say, well, it's God's will. But even God's will is often followed up with God's will, and I really wanted to pursue my education. or and I have yet to meet a woman who has said, I would really like to have 14 children. I would like to have the maximum number of births that I am reproductively capable of. Nobody has said that to me in over 30 plus years of asking. So the reason I say that is that I don't actually believe that the idea of being able to control your body is foreign in any way. I think it is fundamental to who we are as human beings, whether that human being happens to be in Malawi or in Minnesota. I think it really doesn't matter. People want to be able to control their lives, their bodies, to have autonomy, to be able to make decisions. And many of us who entered global health did so because we saw that those decisions that people's lives were constrained because they didn't have access to good health care. In
Mm.
many cases, they didn't have access to clean water. They didn't have access to clean food, clean air. And so, I've selected reproductive health care as the area that I've worked in, but, you know, many of our colleagues work on water, which is still a major public health issue. In 2024, there are still people on the planet that do not have clean water. That's ridiculous to me. But anyway,
It's absurd, isn't it? It really
yeah,
is. I mean, now, A Shot in the Arm is hosted by the Global Listening Project, which was founded by another anthropologist, Heidi Larson. And I can recall Heidi saying to me that when she was talking to respondents in Nigeria around vaccine hesitancy and their anxieties and what was top of their list when it came to COVID-19. Well, it wasn't COVID-19 or vaccination. It was food security, water security, job security. So
that's
I
right.
do think that you anthropologists have a incredibly important role in the 21st century in helping us join these dots.
Yeah, I think that's right, and she makes an excellent point. I mean, at IPAS's work, we do focus on access to abortion and contraception, but we see it as being linked to so many other issues. So, for example, many of our programs work on gender-based violence. We have
Mm.
started to work on climate and climate justice and the linkages between climate and SRHR and sexual and reproductive health and rights. Um, we also support community-based organizations that are working on a wide array of issues. Just general development or community-based organizations that are working on employment, for example, or youth development or anything. And we are supporting them to make the connection between whatever it is their mandate is and sexual and reproductive health and rights. So, it's not that abortion on its own is the only thing we should focus on or worry about. In fact, quite the contrary. I really firmly believe, and IPAS believes, that abortion must be mainstreamed. It is just another health procedure. And as such, it should be part of public health care delivery everywhere and for anyone who needs it.
Yeah, no disagreement here at all. And again, this sort of comprehensive approach to a whole person living, and for girls and women, access to abortion services, access to reproductive health services. These are central, as is education, but they're all central. Could we talk a little bit about IPAS itself and the evolution that you have been part of? I was going to say that you've led, but that would be you'll chastise me for getting that wrong. But you've been part of a process that has begun sharing leadership and governance across all the partners around the world. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure, yeah. And, I want to start by saying that we began the work of thinking about how to change IPAS based on and because of our mission. And just what we were just talking about, sort of the need to prioritize and elevate the voices and work of our colleagues that are working in our program countries. And so our strategy, IPAS's strategy, really, we have an abortion ecosystem approach. And the abortion ecosystem, and we've defined it. We've defined what does it mean to have a sustainable abortion ecosystem. And that ecosystem is different in every location. It's obviously contextually specific. But the people who can best understand and impact this ecosystem are the people who live there and the people who understand it. So the changes that we've made to our operating model are all in service to making sure that our staff and our staff who are all local. IPAS has always had local staff in our country offices, but they actually have the most decision-making authority in the organization. So that was part of our thinking. Like, how do we shift the balance of power and at least move the balance of power? And I have to say, it's not that we've shifted it completely by any means. And I'm not sure that we can, because so much of the power still resides in Europe and the United States. And by power, I mean money
That's
and
right.
education. So resources of all sorts still reside there. So I have a hard time imagining where it's a complete revolution in that sense. But what we've done is kind of move things down the road a bit. So we've done a few things. One of the first decisions that we made was that we were not going to change our structure as the first thing. Many organizations, I think, decide that, okay, we want to completely overhaul our organizational structure. We said, wait a minute. But even if we overhaul our organization structure, we are still the same people. And we still hold the same biases and assumptions and ways of working that we have always held. And so we began by trying to change our behaviors and our practices, sort of the things that make up culture, going back to being an anthropologist, things that make up, organizational culture, behavior, processes, decision-making practices. And we adopted a management approach called shared leadership, where we make decisions based, and it's not consensus. It's not a consensus model, but it's a model that invites feedback and comment from people who would not ordinarily be invited because of the hierarchical structure that typically exists. So I'll give you an example. Money is always a good example, right? So when we're making budget decisions, we have of course a budget committee, but the budget committee actually is not it consists of staff from across the organization. It also changes over time, and everyone in the organization, every unit in the organization, can come before the budget committee and present their budget and make their case for why they have allocated their resources in the way they have, or why they've asked for more money, or whatever they may have done. So, and it's completely transparent. We know who the budget committee members are. Everybody knows. We know what the dates are for making decisions. We know what the process is. We know they report back to the organization. So I think transparency is another really key factor here. And we have made structural changes. In the last several months, we actually have done away with our executive team, which is not to say that we don't have executives. We do have executives. So I'm still the CEO. We have a chief operating officer, and we have a chief financial officer. But other than those three positions, and those three are kind of there because the IPAS US office is still the financially consolidating office, still about the money. And the money actually drives a lot of the decisions in this. But the top governing body of the organization is now called the Network Leadership Group. We adopted a network model for our organization rather than a traditional hub and spoke model, which made the US one node in the network. And the Network Leadership Group is selected by staff. There are 5 members, 2 from Africa, 1 from Asia, 1 from Latin America, and 1 from the United States. And we established criteria, and then people sort of raised their hands and said, yes, I would like to be on this group. And then staff across the network voted on who should be on that group. I am not on that group. The COO is not on that group. The CFO is not on that group. So it's a representative group, and they can only stay in their positions for 2 years.
Does it not lead, though, to here's the criticism that might be leveled against it?
Yeah.
Let's say a degree of cacophony or a sense of no strategic direction.
Yeah.
And what does it mean for people who are, in your case, president, CEO, or perhaps executive director of a country partner? How does all of that work? And how do you counter the argument that it just becomes now basically lacking in structural and strategic direction?
So as I was describing it, we started with our strategy. And one of the things to bear in mind is that IPAS is a very niche organization. We work on abortion and contraception. And while we connect those to other issues, we still work on abortion and contraception. We don't work on HIV. We don't work on childhood immunization. We don't work on clean water. We don't work on 101 other things. We work on these two areas and only those two areas. So we are experts in that. And I think that kind of focus really helps in diminishing the cacophony, as you're suggesting, that could arise. I do agree with you that that we need to spend a lot more effort on communication now than we ever did, because it is absolutely not taken for granted that people across the organization know what's happening. It's much harder to figure out what's happening. You have to work harder to understand it. And there's definitely a degree of, because we also created these nodes and said, okay, that you nodes are more autonomous now. You're able to make decisions on your own without going up and down the chain of command. It means that there's more, we're more diffuse. And that could lead to fragmentation. That's definitely a fear. But it's early days for us yet. We haven't, arrived at that problem yet. But in addition, we also created a group called NetCare, and that group of staff is responsible for the care and feeding of the network. So recognizing that you can't just leave it to chance. You can't just, say, okay, well, everybody figure it out. Please read your emails and then you'll understand what's happening. That it doesn't work like that. So we've invested in actually creating a group of staff, this unit of staff from across the network that is helping us stay in touch, stay coordinated, be aligned. And so, we'll see. It is early days yet. We'll see what
As you
happens.
say, early days, and I think we could probably have an entire podcast on this very issue, because so many organizations are having these same issues and trying to address them in a really holistic way. Just finally on this, you said it's early days. When do you think you'll be able to say, yes, we did it, or we need to rethink?
Yeah, I don't know that. I think from my point of view, I think it'll require at least another 18 months for it to kind of settle in. We do have an evaluation plan. We have sort of metrics for success, and we're evaluating as we go along. The beauty of this is that we made this up, so we can change it. This is all within our control. And we have been. We have been changing things along the way when we realize that, oh, we forgot, we didn't think about that, or, oh, we should have attended to this, or, and so we can change it along the way. There's nothing here that has to be done a certain way. It's tremendous in terms of the creativity that we're able to bring to the organization. One thing that I am seeing already that I think of as a success is we are seeing a lot more collaboration across the organization that does not require staff going through the U.S. office. So no longer is sort of the U.S. kind of holding the information or the resources and directing country staff to other locations. Country staff are now directly going to each other for technical expertise, for operational ideas, and what we're seeing is almost like a ball of yarn of connections that are being made, which is kind of what I had in mind. Really, what we were hoping for is kind of like this, so that we're all kind of wrapped up, and the ball of yarn is moving, propelling down the hill.
Oh, well, we'll be watching your progress very closely, and the invitation is always there to come back and tell us how it's all going. One of the other things that we wanted to talk about when we were first putting this podcast idea together with you was PEPFAR. And obviously, we've not been able to get Congress to approve the usual 5-year spending plan, the appropriation, as we said, and a lot of the reasons for that coming from someone who used to be an ally of PEPFAR, the Representative Chris Smith from New Jersey, is again all about abortion. And I just wondered again, joining the dots between what we were saying in the post-Roe environment, whether this came as a surprise to you, and whether we perhaps should have been better prepared for this sort of knee-jerk reaction.
It was a surprise to me, although I guess in retrospect it shouldn't have been because, the anti-rights groups are so creative in their work. But like many, I think PEPFAR has enjoyed bipartisan support for 20 years. It's been renewed every 5 years without incident. There hasn't been any controversy. And this latest battle is just really shocking because it's completely preposterous. The assertion that PEPFAR money is being used for abortion services is absolutely ridiculous. And I found it particularly disturbing because as the head of IPAS, I've been working and IPAS has been working to repeal the Helms Amendment, which is in place. So it was
and did you want to just remind our listeners and viewers outside the US about the Helms Amendment and what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. The Helms Amendment, it's a U.S. policy that prohibits the use of U.S. foreign assistance funds to pay for abortion as, quote, a method of family planning. But in practice, it's been implemented as a complete ban on abortion-related services and information. It should not be confused with the gag rule, though it is often confused with the gag rule. The gag rule is an executive order. That executive order comes usually into force when a Republican president is in the White House, and it is an order that says that foreign NGOs cannot use private money to advocate or refer for abortions. But that is the gag rule is sort of insult to injury on the long-standing Helms Amendment, which is part of it's like part of a congressional act. So to allege that PEPFAR was using money, U.S. government funds for abortion was completely out of the question. So I think it's really quite a shocking development and very concerning because, as you know, so many millions of people rely on PEPFAR and on those resources to save their lives.
And coming out of COVID, you would think that pandemics and mass epidemics were still in the front of our mind, and the work on AIDS is by no means over. So, yeah.
Not at
So
all.
we're having these conversations at the beginning of 2024, big year for the United States. There are elections, as in so many of the democratic countries around the world. What's your sense of how things are playing out, and particularly now that we're seeing what's likely to happen in both parties, but particularly in the Republican field?
I think what we're seeing is increasing interest, of course, in abortion rights here in the U.S. and mobilization of voters over that issue, which is somewhat heartening. I've certainly in my nearly 30-year career in global health, I've never seen American voters actually vote on abortion. So it's exciting to see that. I hope it kind of continues. I have to say I'm a little bit worried that Americans will lose focus and lose attention and prioritize other issues. So, I am concerned about that. I think we have to be really worried about the likely presidential matchup that we're heading for, Trump v. Biden. And we don't have to guess very much about what a second Trump presidency would mean. The truth is that Project 2025, which is a presidential transition project that has been done by the Heritage Foundation, tells you exactly what a future President Trump would do. And he relied heavily. The Trump administration relied heavily the last time on the Heritage Foundation.
I'm really glad you mentioned Project 2025. I was looking at the members of its advisory board before we came onto this call, and lo and behold, friends of ours that we have clashed with over the course of the years, the Family Research Council, the people who were really influential in driving the anti-LGBT law in Uganda, the very same people who've been pushing anti-abortion legislation and campaigns around Africa, and very active in India as well. And so I think you're absolutely right. We know exactly what we're going to get, and from both a democratic governance perspective, and from a public health perspective, we do need to be concerned. What can we do about it apart from vote?
Well, I think your point about the groups that are involved in these efforts is really important. I think many Americans certainly are not aware of these organizations, don't know who they are, don't know what they're doing. So, Family Watch International is a big one. It was the one that was behind the Uganda LGBTQI law. It's one of the leading U.S. based organizations that has impact around the world. It's grown and it's continues to grow from a small state group to a international group. They claim to be international experts, and they're really pushing pseudoscience and disinformation. So that's a very powerful group. Another group to be really conscious of is the Alliance Defending Freedom. The Alliance Defending Freedom is an advocacy, far right legal advocacy and training group, and it has supported criminalization of sexual relationships between LGBTQI people. And it is behind it. They also have offices around the world, not just in the US. They're the ones that are behind the mifepristone case that has been brought to the FDA to remove mifepristone in the United States. And it should be noted that Senator Josh Hawley's wife, Erin, is a lawyer on that case and is a senior counsel at the Alliance Defending Freedom. So what we're seeing is a close connection between the Republican far right and these organizations that are pushing this agenda. And then finally, CFAM is another group I wanted to mention, which is a US-based anti-LGBTQI organization that has consultative status at the United Nations and has significant access to U.S. policymakers, particularly those that had been in the Trump administration. All of these organizations and more are going to feature very prominently in a future Trump presidency. So, I think it's really incumbent on voters, on Americans, to connect the dots, and really think about who do we want to see in these roles and in these positions of power. One of the things that's really clear is that Republicans have absolutely no compunction about putting in extremists in critical policy roles. The head of HHS last time was literally tracking menstrual periods of migrants. Okay? So these are the people that we can expect to see again in power. I think we just need to ask ourselves, is this what we want for ourselves? And let me just go back to one of my first comments, which is the United States is one of 4 countries to go backwards on abortion rights and abortion access. We are not in keeping with the rest of the world.
I suppose we should be ever so slightly reassured about that.
Yes.
Now, we're getting to the top of the hour, and I guess one final reflection from me is that you have always been like this, but particularly in this conversation, you've been very direct about saying the word abortion. And, in the field that we work in, so for so many years, we've said, reproductive and sexual rights and health, or we've referred to family planning or pregnancy advisory services and so forth. You're very directly saying abortion. And I wonder, as a final question to you, whether you feel it's really incumbent on us now to speak it like it is. This is about abortion. It is healthcare. It is part of ensuring whole person health for girls and women?
So many years ago, I wrote a paper on abortion stigma, and it kind of launched this whole field of research and advocacy on the topic of stigma. And one of the things that I talked about in that article that I wrote with colleagues and subsequently to that is that how important language is and how language can be so deeply stigmatizing. And by kind of running around the word, we actually running around the word abortion, we end up stigmatizing that word abortion. To me, the Helms Amendment stigmatizes abortion. It's the only U.S. policy that singles out a medical procedure. And it's the only foreign aid policy from any country that mentions a medical procedure. And it, to me, it stigmatizes abortion. So yeah, I mean, it's so interesting right now for IPAS. So IPAS is 50 years old, right? We've been working on this topic for a long time. And we're working now in the United States as well. And when we see finally people say abortion is healthcare like you just did, it's so gratifying because for nearly all of our history, we've been saying abortion is a matter of human rights and it's a matter of public health. And it's kind of just that simple. I mean, we've talked about the politics of abortion on this podcast, but in my opinion, it should not be a political matter.
It's a health matter.
It's a
between a patient and her doctor.
Or on her own, increasingly on her own.
Yeah.
It's her, it's the person's decision to decide what to do and make what to happen in their lives. And it's just, it doesn't need to be adjudicated and it doesn't need to be singled out. It's just a simple medical procedure. And it's just fascinating how it becomes so politicized. And I think a lot of that politicization has actually come from the U.S. and from the U.S. right wing, exporting this ideology around the world.
And you rightly corrected me that it is a decision for the woman. It's not a decision for her physician. It's her decision. Well, Anu, I guess you have a very busy year ahead of you, right across the spectrum, from developing the IPAS network to fighting the good fight in the United States and providing women with access to information and services in the United States, as indeed anywhere else. I do hope we can stay in touch and that as things evolve this year, we can check in with you and see how things are going. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you very much to Dr. Anu Kumar from IPAS and all her team. Thanks to our executive producer, Erica Spera from NewsDoc Media, Nick Matuma and the team at Giraffe for their production support. Thanks also to Waisha Raphael, our production coordinator. And of course, a big thanks to you. Now, don't forget to subscribe, give us 5 stars. Remember that A Shot in the Arm podcast is a project of the Global Listening Project. Have a great week and a safe week, everyone.